a spine-tingling, nerve-shattering podcast featuring all your favorite monsters. You won't believe your ears when you listen to Monster Kid Radio. Hear your host, Derek M. Cook, and his ever-rotating stable of guests discuss your favorite classics and sometimes not-so-classic monster movies. Subscribe to Monster Kid Radio through iTunes or Stitcher, or visit monsterkidradio.net before the next weekly episode of Monster Kid Radio. Go through the archives for interviews with Sarah Karloff, Victoria Price, and Joel Hodgson. Listen to discussions about movies like Creature from the Black Lagoon, Island of Terror, and King Kong. And don't forget convention coverage from Monster Bash and the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival. Classic Monsters, Modern Talk, and the Head of Rondo Hatton. Only on Monster Kid Radio.
Greetings, listeners. We're back, once again, to talk to you about the Cthulhu mythos, its books, its monsters, its unfortunate human casualties, its timeline in general, and even its tangential bits, like the Dreamlands, or things of a weird nature, or things that are Lovecraftian leaning, weird fiction, science fiction, horror, learn of terrible meetings in lonely places, of cyclopean ruins and vast staircases that lead down to abysses of nighted secrets, of complex angles that lead through invisible walls to other regions of space and time, and of hideous explorations in remote and forbidden places, on other worlds, and in different time-space continua. From the creation of our galaxy to the death of the sun, this is an exploration of the Cthulhu mythos from the perspective of humans' concept of history. We are the people's guide to the Cthulhu mythos. You can find us at pgttcm.com, pgttcm.podbean.com, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. The People's Guide to the Cthulhu mythos starts now.
The People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. Season 8.
The Sorrow of Search from Time and the Gods by Lord Dunsany. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lescal. It is told also of King Canazar how he bowed very low unto the gods of old. None bowed so low unto the gods of old as did King Canazar. One day the king, returning from the worship of the gods of old, and from bowing before them in the temple of the gods, commanded their prophets to appear before him, saying, I would know somewhat concerning the gods. Then came the prophets before King Canazar, burdened with many books, to whom the king said, It is not in books. Thereat the prophets departed, bearing away with them 1,000 methods well devised in books whereby men may gain wisdom of the gods. One alone remained, a master prophet, who had forgotten books, to whom the king said, The gods of old are mighty. And answered the master prophet, Very mighty are the gods of old. Then said the king, There are no gods, but the gods of old. And answered the prophet, There are none other. And the two being alone within the palace, the king said, Tell me aught concerning gods or men, if aught of the truth be known. Then said the master prophet, Far and wide and straight lieth the road to knowing, and down it in the hidden dust go all wise people of the earth, but in the fields before they come to it, the very wise lie down or pluck the flowers. By the side of the road to knowing, O king, it is hard and hot, stand many temples, and in the doorway of every temple stand many priests, and they cry to the travelers that weary of the road, crying to them, This is the end. And in the temples are the sound of music, and from each roof arises the savor of pleasant burning. And all that look at a cool temple, whichever temple they look at, or hear the hidden music, turn in to see whether it be indeed the end. And such as find that their temple is not indeed the end, set forth again upon the dusty road, stopping at each temple as they pass, for fear they miss the end, or striving onwards on the road, and see nothing in the dust, till they can walk no longer, and are taken worn and weary of their journey into some other temple by a kindly priest, who shall tell them that this also is the end. Neither on that road may a man gain any guiding from his fellows, for only one thing that they say is surely true, when they say, "Friend, we can see nothing for the dust." And of the dust that hides the way, much has been there since ever that road began, and some is stirred up by the feet of all that travel upon it, and more arises from the temple doors. And, O King, it were better for thee, travelling upon that road, to rest when thou hearest one calling, "This is the end," with the sounds of music behind him. And if in the dust and darkness thou pass by Lo and Mush and the pleasant temple of Knash, or Shinath with his opal smile, or Sho with his eyes of agate, yet Shiloh and Minothetep, Gazo and Amirund, and Slig are still before thee, and the priests of their temples will no forget to call thee. And, O King, it is told that only one discerned the end and passed by 3,000 temples, and the priests of the last were like the priests of the first, and all said that their temple was at the end of the road, and the dark of the dust lay over them all, and all were very pleasant, and only the road was weary. And in some were many gods, and in a few only one, and in some the shrine was empty, and all had many priests, and in all the travellers were happy as they rested. And into some his fellow travellers tried to force him, and when he said, "I will travel further," many said, "This man lies, for the road ends here." And he that travelled to the end hath told that when the thunder was heard upon the road, there arose the sound of the voices of all the priests as far as he could hear, crying, "Hearken to Shiloh, hear Mush, Lo, Knash, the voice of Sho. Minothetep is angry, hear the word of Slig." And far away along the road one cried to the traveller that Shinath stirred in his sleep. "O King, this is very doleful. It is told that the traveller came at last to the utter end, and there was a mighty gulf, and in the darkness at the bottom of the gulf one small god crept, no bigger than a hair, whose voice came crying in the cold, 'I know not.' And beyond the gulf was naught, only the small god crying. And he that travelled to the end fled backwards for a great distance till he came to temples again, and entering one where a priest cried, 'This is the end,' lay down and rested on the couch. There Yush sat silent, carved with an emerald tongue and 2 great eyes of sapphire, and there many rested and were happy. And an old priest, coming from comforting a child, came over to that traveller who had seen the end, and said to him, 'This is Yush, and this is the end of wisdom.' And the traveller answered, 'Yush is very peaceful, and this indeed the end. O King, wouldst thou hear more?' And the king said, 'I would hear all.' And the master prophet answered, 'There was also another prophet, and his name was Shan, who had such reverence for the gods of old that he became able to discern their forms by starlight as they strode, and seen by others among men. Each night did Shan discern the forms of the gods, and every day he taught concerning them, till men in Averun knew how the gods appeared all grey against the mountains, and how Rug was higher than Mount Skagadan, and how Skun was smaller, and how Sgul leaned forward as he strode, and how Trodath appeared about him with small eyes. But one night, as Shan watched the gods of old by starlight, he faintly discerned some of the gods that sat far up the slopes of the mountains in the stillness behind the gods.
We'd like to thank you for listening to People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. Our sponsor is BunnySlippers.com, your finest source of wonderful Cthulhu slippers and cool shirts from FoundItemClothing.com, your favorite shirts from your favorite cult films, and also these fine folks.
Of old. And the next day he hurled his robe away that he wore as Averon's prophet, and said to his people, There be gods greater than the gods of old, 3 gods seen faintly on the hills by starlight looking on Averon. And Sean set out and travelled many days, and many people followed him. And every night he saw more clearly the shapes of the 3 new gods who sat silent when the gods of old were striding among men. On the higher slopes of the mountain, Sean stopped with all his people, and there they built a city and worshipped the gods whom only Sean could see, seated above them on the mountain. And Sean taught how the gods were like grey streaks of light seen before dawn, and how the god on the right pointed upward toward the sky, and how the god on the left pointed downward toward the ground, but the god in the middle slept. And in the city, Sean's followers built 3 temples. The one on the right was a temple for the young, and the one on the left a temple for the old, and the third was a temple with doors closed and barred, therein none ever entered. One night, as Sean watched before the 3 gods, sitting like pale light against the mountain, he saw on the mountain's summit 2 gods that spake together and pointed, mocking the gods of the hill, only he heard no sound. The next day Sean set out, and a few followed him to climb to the mountain's summit in the cold, to find the gods who were so great that they mocked at the silent 3. And near the 2 gods they halted and built for themselves huts. Also they built a temple, wherein the 2 were carved by the hand of Sean, with their heads turned towards each other, with mockery on their face, and their fingers pointing, and beneath them were carved the 3 gods of the hill as actors making sport. None remembered now as Gul, Trodath, Skun, and Rug, the gods of old. For many years Sean and his few followers lived in their huts upon the mountain's summit, worshipping gods that mocked, and every night Sean saw the 2 gods by starlight as they laughed to one another in the silence, and Sean grew old. One night, as his eyes were turned towards the 2, he saw across the mountains in the distance a great god sitting in the plain and looming enormous to the sky, who looked with angry eyes towards the 2 as they sat and mocked. Then said Sean to his people, the few that had followed him thither, Alas, that we may not rest, but beyond us in the plain sitteth the one true God, and is wroth with mocking. Let us therefore leave these 2 that sit and mock, and let us find the truth in the worship of that greater God, who even though he kill, shall yet not mock us. But the people answered, Thou hast taken from us many gods, and taught us now to worship gods that mock, and if there is laughter on their faces as we die, lo, thou alone canst see it, and we would rest. But 3 men who had grown old with following followed still, and down the steep mountain on the further side Sean led them, saying, Now we shall surely know. And the 3 old men answered, We shall know indeed, O last of all the prophets. That night the 2 gods, mocking at their worshippers, mocked not at Sean nor his 3 followers, who coming to the plain still travelled on till they came at last to a place where the eyes of Sean at night could closely see the vast form of their god, and beyond them, as far as the sky, there lay a marsh. There they rested, building such shelters as they could, and said to one another, This is the end, for Sean discerneth that there are no more gods, and before us lieth the marsh, and old age hath come upon us. And since they could not labour to build a temple, Sean carved upon a rock all that he saw by starlight of the great god of the plain, so that if ever others forsook the gods of old, because they saw beyond them the greater 3, and should thence come to knowledge of the twain that mocked, and should yet persevere in wisdom till they saw by starlight him whom Sean named the ultimate God, they should still find there upon the rock what one had written concerning the ends of search. For 3 years Sean carved upon the rock, and rising one night from carving, saying, "Now is my labor done," saw in the distance 4 greater gods beyond the ultimate god. Proudly in the distance beyond the marsh, these gods were tramping together, taking no heed of the god upon the plain. Then said Sean to his 3 followers, "Alas, that we know not yet, for there be gods beyond the marsh." None would follow Sean, for they said that old age must end all quests, and that they would rather wait there in the plain for death than that he should pursue them across the marsh. Then Sean said farewell to his followers, saying, "You have followed me well since ever we forsook the gods of old to worship greater gods. Farewell. It may be that your prayers at evening shall avail when you pray the god of the plain, but I must go onward, for there be gods beyond." So Sean went down into the marsh, and for 3 days struggled through it, and on the 3rd night saw the 4 gods not very far away, yet could not discern their faces. All the next day Sean toiled on to see their faces by starlight, but ere the night came up, or 1 star shone, a set of sun, Sean fell down before the feet of his 4 gods. The stars came out, and the faces of the 4 shone bright and clear, but Sean saw them not, for the labor of toiling and seeing was over for Sean. And lo, they were as Gu, Chodoth, Skun, and Rug, the gods of old. Then said the king, "It is well that the sorrow of search cometh only to the wise, for the wise are very few." Also the king said, "Tell me this thing, O prophet, who are the true gods?" The master prophet answered, "Let the king command."
.org. The men of Yarnith. The men of Yarnith hold that nothing began until Yarni Zai uplifted his hand. Yarni Zai, they say, has the form of a man, but is greater, and is a thing of rock. When he uplifted his hand, all the rocks that wandered beneath the dome, by which name they call the sky, gathered together around Yarni Zai. Of the other worlds they say naught, but hold that the stars are the eyes of all the other gods that look on Yarni Zai and laugh, for they are all greater than he, though they have gathered no worlds around them. Yet, though they be greater than Yarni Zai, and though they laugh at him when they speak together beneath the dome, they all speak of Yarni Zai. Unheard is the speaking of the gods to all except the gods, but the men of Yarnith tell of how their prophet Iraun, lying in the sand desert, Azrakhan, heard once their speaking, and knew thereby how Yarni Zai departed from all the other gods to clothe himself with rocks and to make a world. Certain it is that every legend tells that at the end of the valley of Yodeth, where it becomes lost among black cliffs, there sits a figure colossal against a mountain, whose form is the form of a man with the right hand uplifted, but vaster than the hills. And in the book of secret things, which the prophets keep in the temple that stands in Yarnith, is writ the story of the gathering of the world as Iraun heard it, when the gods spake together up in the stillness above Azrakhan. And all that read this may learn how Yarni Zai drew the mountains about him like a cloak, and piled the world below him. It is not set in writing for how many years Yarni Zai sat clothed with rocks at the end of the valley of Yodeth, while there was naught in all the world save rocks and Yarni Zai. But one day there came another god running over the rocks across the world, and he ran as the clouds run upon days of storm, and as he sped towards Yodeth, Yarni Zai, sitting against his mountain with right hand uplifted, cried out, "What dost thou, running across my world, and whither art thou going?" And the new god answered never a word, but sped onwards, and as he went to left of him and to right of him, there sprang up green things all over the rocks of the world of Yarni Zai. So the new god ran round the world and made it green, sowing in the valley where Yarnizai sat monstrous against his mountain, and certain lands wherein Kradoa, the drought, browsed horribly at night. Further, the writing in the book tells of how there came yet another god, running speedily out of the east, as swiftly as the first, with his face set westward, and naught to stay his running, and how he stretched both arms outward beside him, and to left of him and to right of him, as he ran, the whole world whitened. And Yarnizai called out, "What dost thou, running across my world?" And the new god answered, "I bring the snow for all the world, whiteness and resting and stillness." And he stilled the running of streams, and laid his hand even upon the head of Yarnizai, and muffled the noises of the world, till there was no sound in all lands but the running of the new god that brought the snow as he sped across the plains. But the two new gods chased each other for ever round the world, and every year they passed again, running down the valleys and up the hills and away across the plains before Yarnizai, whose hand uplifted had gathered the world about him. And furthermore, the very devout may read how all the animals came up the valley of Yodeth to the mountain whereon rested Yarnizai, saying, "Give us leave to live, to be lions, rhinoceroses and rabbits, and to go about the world." And Yarnizai gave leave to the animals to be lions, rhinoceroses and rabbits, and all the other kinds of beasts, and to go about the world. But when they all had gone, he gave leave to the bird to be a bird, and to go about the sky. And further, there came a man into that valley who said, "Yarnizai, thou hast made animals into thy world. O Yarnizai, ordain that there be men." So Yarnizai made men. Then was there in the world Yarnizai and the two strange gods that brought the greenness and the growing and the whiteness and the stillness, and animals and men. And the god of the greenness pursued the god of the whiteness, and the god of the whiteness pursued the god of the greenness, and men pursued animals, and animals pursued men. But Yarnizai sat still against his mountain with his right hand uplifted. But the men of Yarnis say that when the arm of Yarnizai shall cease to be uplifted, the world shall be flung behind him as a man's cloak is flung away, and Yarnizai, no longer clad with the world, shall go back into the emptiness beneath the dome among the stars, as a diver seeking pearls goes down from the islands. It is writ in Yarnith's histories by scribes of old that there passed a year over the valley of Yarnith that bore not with it any rain, and the famine from the wastes beyond, finding that it was dry and pleasant in Yarnith, crept over the mountains and down their slopes, and sunned himself at the edge of Yarnith's fields. And the men of Yarnith, labouring in the fields, found the famine as he nibbled at the corn and chased the cattle, and hastily they drew water from deep wells and cast it over the famine's dry grey fur, and drove him back to the mountains. But the next day, when his fur was dry again, the famine returned and nibbled more of the corn and chased the cattle further, and again men drove him back. But again the famine returned, and there came a time when there was no more water in the wells to frighten the famine with, and he nibbled the corn till all of it was gone, and the cattle that he chased grew very lean. And the famine drew nearer, even to the houses of men, and trampled on their gardens at night, and ever came creeping nearer to their doors. At last the cattle were able to run no more, and one by one the famine took them by their throats and dragged them down, and at night he scratched in the ground, killing even the roots of things, and came and peered in at the doorways, and started back, and peered in at the door again a little further, but yet was not bold enough to enter altogether, for fear that men should have water to throw over his dry grey fur. Then did the men of Yarnith pray to Yarnizai as he sat far off beyond the valley, praying to him night and day to call his famine back. But the famine sat and purred and slew all the cattle, and dared at last to take men for his food. And the histories tell how he slew children first, and afterwards grew bolder and tore down women, till at last he even sprang at the throats of men as they laboured in the fields. Then said the men of Yarnith, "There must go one to take our prayers to the feet of Yarni Zai, for the world at evening utters many prayers, and it may be that Yarni Zai, as he hears all earth lamenting when the prayers at evening flutter to his feet, may have missed among so many the prayers of the men of Yarnith. But if one go and say to Yarni Zai, there is a little crease in the outer skirts of thy cloak that men call the valley of Yarnith, where the famine is a greater lord than Yarni Zai, it may be that he shall remember for an instant and call his famine back." Yet all men feared to go, seeing that they were but men, and Yarni Zai was lord of the whole earth, and the journey was far and rocky. But that night Hothrun Dath heard the famine whining outside his house and pawing at his door. Therefore it seemed to him more meet to wither before the glance of Yarni Zai than that the whining of that famine should ever again fall upon his ears. So about the dawn Hothrun Dath crept away, fearing still to hear behind him the breathing of the famine, and set out upon his journey whither pointed the graves of men. For men in Yarnith are buried with their feet and faces turned towards Yarni Zai, lest he might beckon to them in their night and call them to him. So all day long did Hothrun Dath follow the way of the graves. It is told that he even journeyed for 3 days and nights with naught but the graves to guide him, as they pointed towards Yarni Zai, where all the world slopes upwards towards Yordith. And the great black rocks that are nearest to Yarni Zai lie gathered together by clans, till he came to the 2 great black pillars of Azdarinth, and saw the rocks beyond them piled in a dark valley, narrow and aloof, and knew that this was Yordith. Then did he haste no more, but walked quietly up the valley, daring not to disturb the stillness, for he said, "Surely this is the stillness of Yarni Zai, which lay about him before he clothed himself with rocks." Here among the rocks which first had gathered to the call of Yarni Zai, Hothrun Dath felt a mighty fear, but yet went onwards because of all his people, and because he knew that thrice in every hour in some dark chamber death and famine met to speak 2 words together, the end. But as dawn turned the darkness into grey, he came to the valley's end, and even touched the foot of Yarni Zai, but saw him not, for he was all hidden in the mist. Then Hothrun Dath feared that he might not behold him, to look him in the eyes, when he sent up his prayer. But laying his forehead against the foot of Yarni Zai, he prayed for the men of Yarnith, saying, "O Lord of famine and father of death, there is a spot in the world that thou hast cast about thee, which men call Yarnith. And there men die before the time thou hast apportioned, passing out of Yarnith. Perchance the famine hath rebelled against thee, or death exceeds his powers. O Master of the world, drive out the famine as a moth out of thy cloak, lest the gods beyond, that regard thee with their eyes, say, there is Yarni Zai, and lo, his cloak is tattered." And in the mist no sign made Yarni Zai. Then did Hothrun Dath pray to Yarni Zai to make some sign with his uplifted hand, that he might know he heard him. In the awe and silence he waited, until nigh the dawn the mist that hid the figure rolled upwards. Serene above the mountains he brooded over the world, silent, with right hand uplifted. What Hothrun Dath saw there upon the face of Yarni Zai no history telleth, or how he came again alive to Yarnith, but this is writ, that he fled, and none hath since beheld the face of Yarni Zai. Some say that he saw a look on the face of the image that set a horror tingling through his soul, but it is held in Yarnith that he found the marks of instruments of carving about the figure's feet, and discerning thereby that Yarni's eye was wrought by the hands of men, he fled down the valley, screaming, "There are no gods, and all the world is lost," and hope departed from him, and all the purposes of life. Motionless behind him, lit by the rising sun, sat the colossal figure with right hand uplifted that man had made in his own image. But the men of Yarnith tell how Hothrun Dath came back again, panting, to his own city, and told the people that there were no gods, and that Yarnith had no hope from Yarni's eye. Then the men of Yarnith, when they knew that the famine came not from the gods, arose and strove against him. They dug deep for wells and slew goats for food, high up on Yarnith's mountains, and went afar and gathered blades of grass, where yet it grew, that their cattle might live. Thus they fought the famine, for they said, "If Yarni's eye be not a god, then is there nothing mightier in Yarnith than men, and who is the famine, that he should bare his teeth against the lords of Yarnith?" And they said, "If no help cometh from Yarni's eye, then is there no help but from our own strength and might, and we be Yarnith's gods, with the saving of Yarnith burning within us, or its doom according to our desire." And some more the famine slew, but others raised their hands, saying, "These be the hands of gods," and drave the famine back till he went from the houses of men and out among the cattle. And still the men of Yarnith pursued him, till above the heat of the fight came the million whispers of rain, heard faintly far off towards evening. Then the famine fled away howling, back to the mountains and over the mountains' crests, and became no more than a thing that is told in Yarnith's legends. 1,000 years have passed across the graves of those that fell in Yarnith by the famine, but the men of Yarnith still pray to Yarni's eye, carved by men's hands in the likeness of a man, for they say, "It may be that the prayers we offer to Yarni's eye may roll upwards from his image, as do the mists at dawn, and somewhere find at last the other gods, or that God who sits behind the others, of whom our prophets know not." End of The Men of Yarnith. For the Honour of the Gods, from Time and the Gods, by Lord Dunsany. Of the great wars of the three islands are many histories writ, and of how the heroes of the olden time one by one were slain, but naught is told of the days before the olden time, or ever the people of the isles went forth to war, when each in his own land tended cattle or sheep, and listless peace obscured those isles in the days before the olden time. For then the people of the islands played like children about the feet of chance, and had no gods, and went not forth to war, but sailors cast by strange winds upon those shores which they named the Prosperous Isles, and finding a happy people which had no gods, told how they should be happier still, and know the gods, and fight for the honour of the gods, and leave their names writ large in histories, and at the last die proclaiming the names of the gods. And the people of the islands met and said, "The beasts we know, but lo, these sailors tell of things beyond, that know us as we know the beasts, and use us for their pleasure as we use the beasts, but yet are apt to answer idle prayer flung up at evening near the hearth, when a man returneth from the ploughing of the fields. Shall we now seek these gods?" And some said, "We are lords of the three islands, and have none to trouble us, and while we live we find prosperity, and when we die our bones have ease in the quiet. Let us not therefore seek those who may loom greater than we do in the islands three, or haply harry our bones when we be dead." But others said, "The prayers that a man mutters when the drought hath come, and all the cattle die, go up unheeded to the heedless clouds, and if somewhere there be those that garner prayer, let us send men to seek them, and to say, there be men in the isles called Three, or sometimes named by sailors the Prosperous Isles, and they be in the central sea, who oft times pray, and it hath been told us that ye love the worship of men, and for it answer prayer, and we be travellers from the islands Three. And the people of the islands were greatly allured by the thought of strange things, neither men nor beasts, who at evening answered prayer. Therefore they sent men down in ships with sails to sail across the sea, and in safety over the sea to a far shore chance brought the ships. Then over hill and valley 3 men set forth, seeking to find the gods, and their comrades beached the ships and waited on the shore. And they that sought the gods followed for 30 nights the lightnings in the sky over 5 mountains. And as they came to the summit of the last, they saw a valley beneath them, and lo, the gods! For there the gods sat, each on a marble hill, each sitting with an elbow on his knee and his chin upon his hand, and all the gods were smiling about their lips. And below them there were armies of little men, and about the feet of the gods they fought against each other, and slew one another for the honour of the gods, and for the glory of the name of the gods. And round them in the valley their cities, that they had builded with the toil of their hands, they burnt for the honour of the gods, where they died for the honour of the gods. And the gods looked down and smiled. And up from the valley fluttered the prayers of men, and here and there the gods did answer a prayer, but oftentimes they mocked them, and all the while men died. And they that had sought the gods from the islands Three, having seen what they had seen, lay down on the mountain summit, lest the gods should see them. Then they crept backwards a little space, still lying down, and whispered together, and then stooped low and ran, and travelled across the mountains in 20 days, and came again to their comrades by the shore. But their comrades asked them if their quest had failed, and the 3 men only answered, "We have seen the gods." And setting sail, the ships hove back across the central sea, and came again to the islands Three, where rest the feet of chance, and said to the people, "We have seen the gods." But to the rulers of the islands they told how the gods drove men in herds, and went back and tended their flocks again, all in the Prosperous Isles, and were kinder to their cattle after they had seen how the gods used men. But the gods, walking large about their valley, and peering over the great mountain's rim, saw one morning the tracks of the 3 men. Then the gods bent their faces low over the tracks, and leaning forward ran, and came before the evening of the day to the shore where the men had set sail in ships, and saw the tracks of ships upon the sand, and waded far out into the sea, and yet saw naught. Still it had been well for the islands Three, had not certain men that had heard the traveller's tale sought also to see the gods themselves. These in the night time slipped away from the isles in ships, and ere the gods had retreated to the hills, they saw where ocean meets the sky the full white sails of those that sought the gods upon an evil day. Then for a while the people of those gods had rest, while the gods lurked behind the mountain, waiting for the travellers from the Prosperous Isles. But the travellers came to shore and beached their ships, and sent 6 of their number to the mountain whereof they had been told. But they after many days returned, having not seen the gods, but only the smoke that went upwards from burnt cities, and vultures that stood in the sky, instead of answered prayer. And they all ran down their ships again into the sea, and set sail again, and came to the Prosperous Isles. But in the distance, crouching behind the ships, the gods came wading through the sea, that they might have the worship of the isles. And to every isle of the 3 the gods showed themselves in different garb and guise, and to all they said, "Leave your flocks, go forth and fight for the honour of the gods." And from one of the isles all the folk came forth in ships to battle for gods that strode through the isle like kings, and from another they came to fight for gods that walked like humble men upon the earth in beggars' rags. And the people of the other isle fought for the honour of gods that were clothed in hair like beasts, and had many gleaming eyes and claws upon their foreheads. But of how these people fought till the isles grew desolate but very glorious, and all for the fame of the gods, are many histories writ.
Thank you for listening to this episode of People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos. I have been your sound editor, DB Spitzer. Check us out at pgttcm.com, pgttcm.podbean.com, pgttcm.threadless.com. How about, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube? We are People's Guide to the Cthulhu Mythos, and most social media, we're just PGTTCM. Thank you so much for listening, and join us again next week for some more Lord Dunsany. Unless this is episode reading 77, then hey, on to the next book.
People